Tartarin of Tarascon, by Alphonse Daudet. Chapter 1. The Mighty Hunter at Home. I remember my first visit to Tartarin of Tarascon as clearly as if it had been yesterday, though it is now more than a dozen years ago. When you had passed into his back garden, you would never have fancied yourself in France. Every tree and plant had been brought from foreign climes. He was such a fellow for collecting the curiosities of nature, this wonderful Tartarin. His garden boasted, for instance, an example of the baobab, that giant of the vegetable world, but Tartarin's specimen was only big enough to occupy a mignonette pot. He was mightily proud of it, all the same. The great sight of his place, however, was the hero's private den at the bottom of the garden. Picture to yourself a large hall gleaming from top to bottom with firearms and weapons of all sorts. Carbines, rifles, blunderbusses, bowie knives, revolvers, daggers, flint arrows, in a word, examples of the deadly weapons of all races used by man in all parts of the world. Everything was neatly arranged and labeled as if it were in a public museum. Poisoned arrows. Please do not touch, was the warning on one of the cards. Weapons loaded. Have a care, greeted you from another. My word, it required some pluck to move about in the den of the great Tartarin. There were books of travel and adventure, books about mighty hunting on the table in the center of the room, and seated at the table was a short and rather fat, red-haired fellow of about 45, with a closely trimmed beard and a pair of bright eyes. He was in his shirt-sleeves, reading a book held in one hand while he gesticulated wildly with a large pipe in the other. Tartarin. He was evidently imagining himself the daring hero of the story. Now you must know that the people of Tarascon were tremendously keen on hunting, and Tartarin was the chief of the hunters. You may think this funny when you know there was not a living thing to shoot at within miles of Tarascon. Scarcely a sparrow to attract local sportsmen. Ah, but you don't know how ingenious they are down there. Every Sunday morning off the huntsmen sallied with their guns and ammunition, the hounds yelping at their heels. Each man as he left in the morning took with him a brand new cap, and when they got well into the country and were ready for sport, they took their caps off, threw them high in the air, and shot at them as they fell. In the evening you would see them returning with their riddled caps stuck on the points of their guns, and of all these brave men Tartarin was the most admired, as he always swung into town with the most hopeless rag of a cap at the end of a day's sport. There's no mistake, he was a wonder, but for all his adventurous spirit, he had a certain amount of caution. There were really two men inside the skin of Tartarin. The one Tartarin said to him, "Cover yourself with glory." The other said to him, "Cover yourself with flannel." The one, imagining himself fighting Red Indians, would call for an axe. An axe. Somebody give me an axe. The other, knowing that he was cozy by his fireside, would ring the bell and say, "Jane, my coffee." One evening at Costecalde's, the gunsmith's, when Tartarin was explaining some mechanism of a rifle, the door was opened and an excited voice announced, "A lion! A lion!" The news seemed incredible, but you can imagine the terror that seized the little group at the gunsmith's as they asked for more news. It appeared that the lion was to be seen in a traveling menagerie newly arrived from Beaucaire. A lion at last, and here in Tarascon. Suddenly, when the full truth had dawned upon Tartarin, he shouldered his gun, and, turning to Major Bravida, "Let us go to see him," he thundered. Following him went the cap hunters. Arrived at the menagerie, where many Tarasconians were already wandering from cage to cage, Tartarin entered with his gun over his shoulder to make inquiries about the king of beasts. His entrance was rather a wet blanket on the other visitors, who, seeing their hero thus armed, thought there might be danger and were about to flee. But the proud bearing of the great man reassured them, and Tartarin continued his round of the booth until he faced the lion from the Atlas Mountains. Here he stood carefully studying the creature, who sniffed and growled in surly temper, and then, rising, shook his mane and gave vent to a terrible roar, directed full at Tartarin. Tartarin alone stood his ground, stern and immovable, in front of the cage, and the valiant cap hunters, somewhat reassured by his bravery, again drew near and heard him murmur, as he gazed on the lion, "Ah, yes, there's a hunt for you." Not another word did Tartarin utter that day. Yet next day nothing was spoken about in the town but his intention to be off to Algeria to hunt the lions of the Atlas Mountains. When asked if this were true, his pride would not let him deny it, and he pretended that it might be true. So the notion grew, until that night at his club Tartarin announced, amid tremendous cheering, that he was sick of cap hunting, and meant very soon to set forth in pursuit of the lions of the Atlas. Now began a great struggle between the two Tartarins. While the one was strongly in favor of the adventure, the other was strongly opposed to leaving his snug little baobab villa and the safety of Tarascon. But he had let himself in for this, and felt he would have to see it through. So he began reading up the books of African travel, and found from these how some of the explorers had trained themselves for the work by enduring hunger, thirst, and other privations before they set out. Tartarin began cutting down his food, taking very watery soup. Early in the morning, too, he walked round the town 7 or 8 times, and at nights he would stay in the garden from 10 till 11 o'clock, alone with his gun, to inure himself to night chills, while, so long as the menagerie remained in Tarascon, a strange figure might have been seen in the dark, prowling around the tent, listening to the growling of the lion. This was Tartarin, accustoming himself to be calm when the king of beasts was raging. The feeling began to grow, however, that the hero was shirking. He showed no haste to be off. At length, one night Major Bravida went to Baobab Villa and said very solemnly, "Tartarin, you must go." It was a terrible moment for Tartarin, but he realized the solemnity of the words, and looking around his cozy little den with a moist eye, he replied at length in a choking voice, "Bravida, I shall go." Having made this irrevocable decision, he now pushed ahead his final preparations with some show of haste. From Bompards he had 2 large trunks, one inscribed with Tartarin of Tarascon, case of arms, and he sent to Marseilles all manner of provisions of travel, including a patent camp tent of the latest style. Chapter 2. Tartarin sets off to Lionland. Then the great day of his departure arrived. All the town was agog. The neighborhood of Baobab Villa was crammed with spectators. About 10 o'clock the bold hero issued forth. "He's a Turk. He's wearing spectacles." This was the astonished cry of the beholders, and, sure enough, Tartarin had thought it his duty to don Algerian costume because he was going to Algeria. He also carried 2 heavy rifles, one on each shoulder, a huge hunting knife at his waist, and a revolver in a leather case. A pair of large blue spectacles were worn by him, for the sun in Algeria is terribly strong, you know. At the station the doors of the waiting room had to be closed to keep the crowd out, while the great man took leave of his friends, making promises to each, and jotting down notes on his tablets of the various people to whom he would send lion skins. "Oh, that I had the brush of an artist, that I might paint you some pictures of Tartarin during his 3 days aboard the Zoo on the voyage from Marseilles. But I have no facility with the brush, and mere words cannot convey how he passed from the proudly heroic to the hopelessly miserable in the course of the journey. Worst of all, while he was groaning in his stuffy bunk, he knew that a very merry party of passengers were enjoying themselves in the saloon. He was still in his bunk when the ship came to her moorings at Algiers, and he got up with a sudden jerk, under the impression that the Zoo was sinking. Seizing his many weapons, he rushed on deck, to find it was not foundering, but only arriving. Soon after Tartarin had set foot on shore, following a great Negro porter, he was almost stupefied by the babble of tongues. But, fortunately, a policeman took him in hand and had him directed, together with his enormous collection of luggage, to the European Hotel. On arriving at his hotel, he was so fatigued that his marvelous collection of weapons had to be taken from him, and he had to be carried to bed, where he snored very soundly until it was striking 3 o'clock. He had slept all the evening, through the night and morning, and well into the next afternoon. He awakened refreshed, and the first thought in his mind was, "I'm in Lionland at last." But the thought sent a cold shiver through him, and he dived under the bedclothes. A moment later he determined to be up. Exclaiming, "Now for the lions!" He jumped on the floor and began his preparations. His plan was to get out at once into the country, take ambush for the night, shoot the first lion that came along, and then back to the hotel for breakfast. So off he went, carrying not only his usual arsenal, but the marvelous patent tent strapped to his back. He attracted no little attention as he trudged along, and catching sight of a very fine camel, his heart beat fast, for he thought the lions could not be far off now. It was quite dark by the time he had got only a little way beyond the outskirts of the town, scrambling over ditches and bramble hedges. After much hard work of this kind, the mighty hunter suddenly stopped, whispering to himself, "I seem to smell a lion hereabouts." He sniffed keenly in all directions. To his excited imagination, it seemed a likely place for a lion. So, dropping on one knee and laying one of his guns in front of him, he waited. He waited very patiently. 1 hour, 2 hours, but nothing stirred. Then he suddenly remembered that great lion hunters take a little young goat with them to attract the lion by its bleating. Having forgotten to supply himself with one, Tartarin conceived the happy idea of bleating like a kid. He started softly calling, "Meh, meh." He was really afraid that a lion might hear him, but as no lion seemed to be paying attention, he became bolder in his mehs, until the noise he made was more like the bellowing of a bull. But hush! What was that? A huge black object had for the moment loomed up against the dark blue sky. It stooped, sniffing the ground, then seemed to move away again, only to return suddenly. It must be the lion at last. So, taking a steady aim, bang went the gun of Tartarin, and a terrible howling came in response. Clearly his shot had told. The wounded lion had made off. He would now wait for the female to appear, as he had read in books. But 2 or more hours passed and she did not come, and the ground was damp and the night air cold, so the hunter thought he would camp for the night. After much struggling, he could not get his patent tent to open. Finally, he threw it on the ground in a rage and lay on the top of it. Thus he slept until the bugles in the barracks nearby wakened him in the morning. For behold, instead of finding himself out on the Sahara, he was in the kitchen garden of some suburban Algerian. "These people are mad," he growled to himself, "to plant their artichokes where lions are roaming about. Surely I have been dreaming. Lions do come here. There's proof positive." From artichoke to artichoke, from field to field, he followed the thin trail of blood, and came at length to a poor little donkey he had wounded. Tartarin's first feeling was one of vexation. There is such a difference between a lion and an ass, and the poor little creature looked so innocent. The great hunter knelt down and tried to stanch the donkey's wounds, and it seemed grateful to him, for it feebly flapped its long ears 2 or 3 times before it lay still forever. Suddenly a voice was heard calling, "Noiraude! Noiraude!" It was the female. She came in the form of an old French woman with a large red umbrella, and it would have been better for Tartarin to have faced a female lion. When the unhappy man tried to explain how he had mistaken her little donkey for a lion, she thought he was making fun of her, and belabored him with her umbrella. When her husband came on the scene, the matter was soon adjusted by Tartarin agreeing to pay £8 for the damage he had done, the price of the donkey being really something like 8 shillings. The donkey owner was an innkeeper, and the sight of Tartarin's money made him quite friendly. He invited the lion hunter to have some food at the inn with him before he left. And as they walked thither, he was amazed to be told by the innkeeper that he had never seen a lion there in 20 years. Clearly, the lions were to be looked for further south. "I'll make tracks for the south too," said Tartarin to himself. But he first of all returned to his hotel in an omnibus. Think of it! But before he was to go south on the high adventure, he loafed about the city of Algiers for some time, going to the theaters and other places of amusement, where he met Prince Gregory of Montenegro, with whom he made friends. One day the captain of the Zoo came across him in the town, and showed him a note about himself in a Tarascon newspaper. This spoke of the uncertainty that prevailed as to the fate of the great hunter, and wound up with these words. Some Negro traders state, however, that they met in the open desert a European whose description answers to that of Tartarin, and who was making tracks for Timbuktu. May heaven guard for us our hero. Tartarin went red and white by turns as he read this, and realized that he was in for it. He very much wished to return to his beloved Tarascon, but to go there without having shot some lions, one at least, was impossible, and so it was southward ho! Chapter 3. Tartarin's Adventures in the Desert. The lion hunter was keenly disappointed, after a very long journey in the stagecoach, to be told that there was not a lion left in all Algeria, though a few panthers might still be found worth shooting. He got out at the town of Miliana, and let the coach go on, as he thought he might as well take things easily if, after all, there were no lions to be shot. To his amazement, however, he came across a real live lion at the door of a cafe. "What made them say there were no more lions?" he cried, astounded at the sight. The lion lifted in its mouth a wooden bowl from the pavement, and a passing Arab threw a copper in the bowl, at which the lion wagged its tail. Suddenly the truth dawned on Tartarin. He was a poor, blind, tame lion, which a couple of Negroes were taking through the streets, just like a performing dog. His blood was up at the very idea, shouting, "You scoundrels, to humiliate these noble beasts so!" He rushed and took the degrading bowl from the royal jaws of the lion. This led to a quarrel with the Negroes, at the height of which Prince Gregory of Montenegro came upon the scene. The prince told him a most untrue story about a convent in the north of Africa where lions were kept, to be sent out with priests to beg for money. He also assured him that there were lots of lions in Algeria, and that he would join him in his hunt. Thus it was in the company of Prince Gregory, and with a following of half a dozen Negro porters, that Tartarin set off early next morning for the Shirif Plain. But they very soon had trouble, both with the porters and with the provisions Tartarin had brought for his great journey. The prince suggested dismissing the Negroes and buying a couple of donkeys, but Tartarin could not bear the thought of donkeys, for a reason with which we are acquainted. He readily agreed, however, to the purchase of a camel, and when he was safely helped up on its hump, he sorely wished the people of Tarascon could see him. But his pride speedily had a fall, for he found the movement of the camel worse than that of the boat in crossing the Mediterranean. He was afraid he might disgrace France. Indeed, if truth must out, France was disgraced. So, for the remainder of their expedition, which lasted nearly a month, Tartarin preferred to walk on foot and lead the camel. One night in the desert, Tartarin was sure he heard sounds just like those he had studied at the back of the traveling menagerie at Tarascon. He was positive they were in the neighborhood of a lion at last. He prepared to go forward and stalk the beast. The prince offered to accompany him, but Tartarin resolutely refused. He would meet the king of beasts alone, entrusting his pocketbook, full of precious documents and banknotes, to the prince, in case he might lose it in a tussle with the lion. He moved forward. His teeth were chattering in his head when he lay down, trembling, to await the lion. It must have been 2 hours before he was sure that the beast was moving quite near him in the dry bed of a river. Firing 2 shots in the direction whence the sound came, he got up and bolted back to where he had left the camel and the prince, but there was only the camel there now. The prince had waited a whole month for such a chance. In the morning he realized that he had been robbed by a thief who pretended to be a prince. And here he was in the heart of savage Africa with a little pocket money only, much useless luggage, a camel, and not a single lion skin for all his trouble. Sitting on one of the desert tombs erected over pious Mohammedans, the great man fell to weeping bitterly. But, even as he wept, the bushes were pushed aside a little in front of him, and a huge lion presented itself. To his honor, be it said, Tartarin never moved a muscle, but, breathing a fervent "at last," he leapt to his feet, and, leveling his rifle, planted 2 explosive bullets in the lion's head. All was over in a moment, for he had nearly blown the king of beasts to pieces. But in another moment he saw 2 tall, enraged Negroes bearing down upon him. He had seen them before at Milianah, and this was their poor blind lion. Fortunately for Tartarin, he was not so deeply in the desert as he had thought, but merely outside the town of Orleansville, and a policeman now came up, attracted by the firing, and took full particulars. The upshot of it was that he had to suffer much delay in Orleansville, and was eventually fined £100. How to pay this was a problem which he solved by selling all his extensive outfit, bit by bit. When his debts were paid, he had nothing but the lion's skin and the camel. The former he dispatched to Major Bravida at Tarascon. Nobody would buy the camel, and its master had to face all the journey back to Algiers in short stages on foot. Chapter 4. The Homecoming of the Hero. The camel showed a curious affection for him, and followed him as faithfully as a dog. When, at the end of 8 days' weary tramping, he came at last to Algiers, he did all he could to lose the animal, and hoped he had succeeded. He met the captain of the Zoo, who told him that all Algiers had been laughing at the story of how he had killed the blind lion, and he offered Tartarin a free passage home. The Dzo was getting up steam next day as the dejected Tartarin had just stepped into the captain's longboat, when, lo! His faithful camel came tearing down the quay and gazed affectionately at its friend. Tartarin pretended not to notice it, but the animal seemed to implore him with his eyes to be taken away. "You are the last Turk," it seemed to say. "I am the last camel. Let us never part again, oh my Tartarin." But the lion hunter pretended to know nothing of this ship of the desert. As the boat pulled off to the Dzo, the camel jumped into the water and swam after it, and was taken aboard. At last Tartarin had the joy of hearing the Dzo cast anchor at Marseilles, and, having no luggage to trouble him, he rushed off the boat at once and hastened through the town to the railway station, hoping to get ahead of the camel. He booked third class and quickly hid himself in a carriage. Off went the train. But it had not gone far when everybody was looking out of the windows and laughing. Behind the train ran the camel holding his own, too. What a humiliating homecoming. All his weapons of the chase left on Moorish soil. Not a lion with him. Nothing but a silly camel. Tarascon! Tarascon! Shout the porters as the train slows up at the station, and the hero gets out. He had hoped to slink home unobserved. But, to his amazement, he is received with shouts of "Long live Tartarin!" 3 cheers for the lion slayer. The people are waving their caps in the air. It is no joke. They are serious. There is Major Bravida, and there the more noteworthy cap hunters, who cluster round their chief and carry him in triumph down the stairs. Now, all this was the result of sending home the skin of the blind lion. But the climax was reached when, following the crowd down the stairs of the station, limping from his long run, came the camel. Even this Tartarin turned to good account. He reassured his fellow citizens, patting the camel's hump. "This is my camel, a noble beast. It has seen me kill all my lions." And so, linking his arm with the worthy major, he calmly wended his way to Baobab Villa, amid the ringing cheers of the populace. On the road, he began a recital of his hunts. "Picture to yourself," he said, "a certain evening in the open Sahara,